Okay, real talk. Everyone is out here debating whether Drake's album was mid or not, whether Rick Ross had bars or not, whether this beef was real or just clout chasing. But nobody is asking the actual question that matters. Why did Rick Ross turn on Drake in the first place? Because I promise you, it had absolutely nothing to do with music, nothing to do with bars, nothing to do with who is the better rapper. This was personal. This was ego. And this was about one word that Drake said to Rick Ross that started all of this. That word was no. Stay with me. Before we get into the real reason, you need to understand why this beef felt off from jump. When Rick Ross started coming at Drake, something about it didn't sit right with a lot of people. And I don't mean that from a taking sides perspective. I mean it from a timing and logic perspective. Because Rick Ross and Drake were not strangers. These were not two people who had been subtweeting each other for years, building up to something. These were two people who had made music together, who had been in the same circles, who had publicly shown each other love. So when Ross started going in calling Drake mid, making personal jokes, going at his appearance, the natural question was, why now? What changed? What happened between these two that made Ross decide this was the moment to turn? And the host in this podcast laid out the most honest and well-reasoned.
You and Drake, but man, you got to stop lying to yourself. If Drake said you were trash as a musician, I wouldn't believe him. And you saying that Drake is mid, I don't believe you. I think you guys have the most and utmost respect in terms of you guys' musical skill. But this is a play where I think it's about ego. I honestly...
Right there. That is the foundation of everything. This is not a music beef. This is an ego beef. And once you understand that everything Ross has said and done in this situation starts making complete sense. To understand why Ross feels the way he feels, you need to go back and understand what a cosign actually means in hip-hop. And specifically what Ross's cosign meant for Drake when Drake was coming up. In hip-hop, there are levels. And there is a very specific thing that happens when a younger artist is trying to cross over from one audience to another. They need somebody who is already credible in that space to vouch for them. To say, yeah, this person is legitimate. You can rock with this. Drake came up through Young Money. He had Lil Wayne's cosign, which was massive. But Wayne's lane and Ross's lane were different. Ross represented something specific, that Miami street credibility, that Maybach music weight, that particular audience that took the culture seriously in a certain way. And Ross gave Drake that bridge.
I've diagnosed their issue to be Ross feels like Drake started feeling himself and got bigger than the program. All while niggas like Ross was his cosign for people in the quote-unquote streets to be like, oh, nah, this is like some cool shit to listen to. I think he feel like...
That line right there, cosign for people in the streets to be like this, is some cool stuff to listen to. That is the key to this whole thing. Ross was one of the people who made it okay for a certain audience to rock with Drake. He was a bridge. He was a validator. And in the cosign economy of hip-hop that carries weight, that carries debt, that is something that is supposed to be remembered and honored. Ross remembered it. He kept track of it. And at some point he felt like Drake forgot. Now we get to the specific thing that actually broke this relationship. And this is the part that people keep dancing around without just saying it directly. Drake told Ross no. To what exactly, we do not know the full details publicly. But the host's read on this is the most logical explanation that has been put forward anywhere.
No, I love them on Gold Roses as well. But clearly, I think what happened is Drake told him no. Drake told him no to something. And I think he feels that, yo, this guy think he bigger than the program. I'm going to put him in his place. It got a little personal because Ross he's a entertaining guy.
Think about the psychology of that for a second. Ross is someone who came up in an era where loyalty and reciprocity were the foundation of everything. You helped someone, they helped you back. You put someone on, they remembered it. You co-signed someone, they came back when you needed them. And Drake, who operates in a very different way, who has always been more calculated and more selective about who he does music with and who he shows public loyalty to, at some point said no to something Ross brought to the table. Maybe it was a feature. Maybe it was an album collab. Maybe it was something else entirely. But whatever it was, Ross took it personally. And in Ross's world, when you take something personally, it comes out. Here is a detail that most people blew past but is actually very telling. The host mentioned the last time Ross and Drake actually collaborated on music.
Like, Drake has went ghost. Drake don't really do music with him anymore. Last time he did a song was, I believe, Lemon Pepper Freestyle, even though I love them on Gold.
Lemon Pepper Freestyle. That was 2021. That is how long it has been since these two actually worked together on music. Now think about what Drake has done since 2021. The certified lover boy era. Honestly, never mind. Her Loss with 21 Savage. For All the Dogs. He has worked with a massive list of artists across all of that. Ross was not on any of it. And that absence, that being left out, that is something that builds up quietly. You watch someone you helped build continue to grow, continue to work with other people, continue to rack up plaques and streams and cultural moments. And you are not part of any of it. That silence is loud, especially when you feel like you are owed a seat at that table. Now here is the piece of evidence that actually confirms everything the host was theorizing. And this one is specific. This one is concrete.
I'm telling you, that one clip where like they're giddy and they're talking to GQ and they're like, yo, maybe Drake's on the album. I feel like they thought Drake was gonna come through for something. They never came through. They salty. And they're like, yo, this guy always does this shit. He think he bigger than the program. All right, fuck it. And then once they saw everybody hopping out on Drake, they were like, all right, fuck it.
This is the smoking gun of this entire beef. There was a GQ interview or a similar media moment where Ross and his team were visibly excited about the possibility of Drake being on the album. They were talking about it publicly. They were hyped about it. They put it out there that this was potentially happening. And then Drake did not come through. Now put yourself in Ross's position for a second. You have publicly, in front of media, in front of your fans, in front of the culture, suggested that Drake might be on your project. You have let people get excited about that possibility. And then Drake does not show up. That is embarrassing. That is a public L. And in hip-hop, where everything is about image and power and who respects who, that kind of public slight does not get forgotten quietly. Ross and his team felt that. They felt it immediately. And the host is right. That is where the he thinks he's bigger than the program energy comes from. Because Drake not showing up for that album sent a very clear message. I do not need this. I am not doing this. And Ross heard that message loud and clear. Here is something worth thinking about. Even if all of this is true, even if Ross felt slighted, felt owed, felt like Drake disrespected the relationship, why did he choose this particular moment to go public with it? The timing matters. Because Ross did not go at Drake quietly. He did not try to handle it privately. He went loud. He went personal. He went at Drake's appearance, at his nose, at the BBL rumors, at everything. And the host explains the timing perfectly.
I think he bigger than the program. All right, fuck it. And then once they saw everybody hopping out on Drake, they were like, all right, fuck it. Let's hop out on him too. Anyway.
That is the piece that completes the picture. Ross had been sitting on this frustration for a while. The feelings were already there. The sense that Drake had outgrown the relationship and was not honoring what Ross felt he was owed, that had been building quietly. But Ross is also a businessman, and a smart one. He was not going to go at Drake when Drake was at his absolute peak and untouchable. That is not a smart move. That is not how you win in this game. He waited. And when the moment came, when Kendrick Lamar had already cracked Drake's armor, when the culture had already turned, when people were already looking for reasons to pile on, Ross made his move. That is not coincidence. That is calculation. That is someone who had been waiting for the Chapin when it recognized it when it opened. This might be the most honest and important observation in this entire podcast, and it is the one that cuts through all the noise. Because Ross has been very publicly saying Drake is mid, saying his album was trash, saying he has no real classics, going on and on about how Drake does not measure up, and the host just flatly says, I do not believe any of that.
Ross, I think you're making things go from bad to worse. And clearly, it got real personal between you.
That is a remarkably honest thing to say in the middle of a situation where everyone else is just picking sides and validating whoever they already liked. The host is saying, look, I see what is happening here. This is not a genuine musical critique. This is a personal beef being expressed through musical criticism. And those are two very different things. If Ross genuinely thought Drake was mid, he would not have made music with him. He would not have been publicly hyped about potentially having Drake on his album. He would not have spent years co-signing him to street audiences. You do not co-sign someone you think is mid. You do not get excited about a collab with someone you think cannot rap. The behavior does not match the current words. And that gap between what Ross is saying now and how he behaved for years tells you everything about what this is actually about. Here is the uncomfortable truth about where Rick Ross ends up in this whole situation. Going at Drake was always going to be a complicated move. Because Drake, whatever you think of him musically or personally, is one of the most commercially successful artists in the history of recorded music. The numbers are real. The catalog is real. The streaming numbers are real. And when you go at someone at that level, especially when you go personal, you better come with something that actually lands. Something that actually damages. Something that the culture can point to and say, yeah, he got him. The host was honest about this too.
Kind of co-signing him being a PDF. You're clowning his nose, calling him BBL Drizzy. I don't know, bro.
And that is the real problem for Ross coming out of this. The personal shots, the nose jokes, the BBL stuff, the appearance stuff, those did not land the way Ross probably thought they would. Because when you go personal on someone and the culture does not fully rally behind you, it just looks bitter. It looks like someone who is upset about something they will not say directly. And the irony is, if Ross had just been honest about what this was actually about, people might have respected it more. If he had said, look, I put this man on, I felt like he forgot where he came from. I felt disrespected when he did not show up for my album, people would have understood that. That is a relatable human feeling. Instead, he went at the music. And the music critique does not hold up under scrutiny. Because the same person calling Drake mid is the same person who was giddily telling GQ that Drake might be on his album. You cannot have it both ways. Now, let's zoom out for a second. Because what happened between Ross and Drake is not unique. This exact same dynamic plays out over and over again in this industry. Artist A helps Artist B come up, gives them credibility, opens doors, makes introductions, validates them to a new audience. Artist B blows up, gets bigger than everyone around them. And at some point, Artist B starts making decisions based on where they are now rather than where they came from. Artist A feels left behind, feels forgotten, feels like the debt is not being honored, and the relationship that used to be solid starts to crack. We have seen this with so many different pairs of artists over the years. The person who came up bigger always gets accused of forgetting where they came from. And sometimes that accusation is fair. And sometimes the person who is accusing them is just upset that the other person grew beyond what they could offer. In Ross and Drake's case, it is probably somewhere in between. Drake has always been selective. Drake has always operated on his own timeline in his own terms. That is partly why he got as big as he got. But that selectivity has a cost. And the cost is that people who felt they were owed something from him eventually stopped being quiet about it. Ross just happened to be the loudest about it, and at the most public moment possible. So here is where we land after breaking all of this down properly. Rick Ross turning on Drake had nothing to do with music, nothing to do with bars or albums or streaming numbers. It had everything to do with a relationship that Ross felt was not being honored, a cosign that he felt was not being remembered, and a no somewhere along the way that Ross took as a sign that Drake thought he was bigger than the people who helped build him. The GQ interview where they were excited about Drake potentially being on the album and then Drake not showing up, that is the clearest piece of evidence we have of when and why things broke down. And Ross choosing to go public with it at the exact moment when everyone else was already piling on Drake, that tells you this was calculated. This was waiting for the right window. This was not spontaneous emotion. This was a long time coming. Whether you think Ross was right or wrong in how he handled it, the host said the most honest thing about all of this. Ross needs to stop lying to himself about thinking Drake is mid. Because the behavior for years before this beef says something completely different. This was personal. It was always personal. Drop in the comments, do you think Drake actually owes Ross anything? Or did Ross just overstay his welcome in Drake's circle and not want to admit it? Because both of those things can be true at the same time. Subscribe if you want breakdowns that actually go underneath the surface. We are not just here to repeat what everyone else is saying. Catch you in the next one.